All right, folks. Morning. Morning. Let's do that again. Good morning.
Good morning, Mike.
All right, super. It's good to be back here again, talking about this with you folks. Thanks for returning or being here the first time. You should find the handouts around the tables, so there'll be plenty for you. Let me begin with prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, I thank you for your mercy, and I ask you please to help us understand where we are in the course of the story of redemption and how we should live in the world that you've given to us, the world that you're working in. It's so severely broken. Help us know how to be Christians and members of the political community that we're part of. Help us know how to do both well, but all for Christ's sake. Amen. There's a book by David Lloyd Dusenberry, who I am about 95% sure is the son of a guy I went to seminary with, but I haven't been able to track it down, called The Political Life of Judge No One, A Political Life of Jesus. I'd encourage you to read it. It's a little bit wonky, so, a bit geeked out, so I'm not sure it'd be a great read for you, but we'll dive into some of its geekiness in a little bit. I found this quote striking. I put at the top of the handout. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus' sayings seem to reflect a near total sense of disillusionment with the machinery of government, which he reveals to be, inter alia, a machinery of judgment. I wonder if somebody could close that door. So let's just play with that just a little bit, and I'll ask you to reflect on the Gospels and think about where he took that from. Where does Jesus express, if you think he does, such ambivalent, or maybe less than ambivalent, expectations about government? It's hard to answer, isn't it?
Well, he calls the Pharisees whitewashed tombs.
He does. And they are in certainly a social structure of authority. So that's true.
Render under Caesar's.
Yeah, render under Caesar. What is Caesar? He has sort of a casual, whatever. I'm obviously putting words in Jesus' mouth, but his attitude is, whatever, let's go, as we'll talk to a little bit, let's go directly. Well, we'll do that in a little while. We'll go to the whole coin and the fish mouth and everything. But let's go to the trial scenes in the Gospels. What's Jesus' attitude towards the temple state of Israel and Jerusalem, and also what's effectively, we'll see in a little while, the temple state of Rome? How does he behave in those trials toward them? Yes?
He doesn't really submit to what they're trying to force him to do. He stays with what...
He certainly stays aligned with God's purpose for him, but he doesn't really engage them. He submits to their authority without accepting the fullness of their authority. Remember, you would have no authority over me if it had not been what? Given to you from above. So you'd probably get a fuller flavor if you slog through Dusenberry's entire book. But the point is, Jesus clearly has a tempered view towards the effectiveness, and sometimes in some levels even the legitimacy of the civic political bodies that he's involved in. I think that's helpful for us because we're clearly told to obey them. And Jesus, as we'll see in a little while, submits himself to them. But Jesus' vision of the political world that he was subjected to so brutally is very realistic. And I think that's a good starting point for us when we start to think about what we expect out of governments, about whether it's local or national or state. There should be a full and robust respect for their authority, as we saw last week, but there should also be a reticence to fully embrace their ultimate place in the course of human history, ultimately in the consummation of the ages, and also what they're about and what they can do. Now that's coming from someone who we'll see in a little while in our study is a king himself. And that's going to flavor that. But since Jesus is a king and everyone's worried about Christians establishing a theocracy, I thought after that brief introduction we should talk about theocracies. Who's up for talking about the Old Testament theocracy? That's always fun, right? So take a look at Deuteronomy 17. This is one of the most remarkable passages that's often overlooked when we consider or think about the theocracy in the Old Testament. This, of course, is written by Moses long before, hundreds of years before they had a king. But this is what Moses says when they're on the edge of the promised land, beginning in verse 14. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and you have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like the nations around us, be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your own brothers. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord God has told you, you are not to go back that way. If you know, by the way, the story of the kings when they actually came, that's pretty much exactly what they did. They did exactly those things. But you are not to go back. So verse 17, he must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. Is anyone coming to mind here? Yeah, he must not accumulate large amounts of silver or gold. And listen to this, when he takes the throne, this is really what I want to focus on, of the kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law taken from that of the priests who are the Levites. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees. Now, it's a little anachronistic to speak in these terms, but what we essentially have here is certainly a theocracy, but it's also a constitutional royalty. Like the king is never given in the scriptures. The king is never given absolute authority over his people. He's always called, interestingly, to write himself. The emphasis is pretty clear. He's supposed to write out the law. He's supposed to meditate on it. He's supposed to read it. He is supposed to, called to, demanded to subject himself to someone who's greater than him. Which starts to give us insight into why Jesus has this ambivalent attitude about the inverted and perverted realities of the political world that he's in. Not only should they just generically always subject themselves to God, but they don't even know who they're speaking to. They're speaking to the king himself. So when we think about the theocracy of the Israelites, I want us to understand that it started with what we might call a constitutional, or probably more properly, a covenantal monarchy was envisioned. And if you go through the outline that I've got here, there's eventually the king emerges. We're not going to go through the whole story. Saul shows up first and he's selected. He doesn't do very well. Then David comes and David does better till he really doesn't do better. But that passage in 2 Samuel is when God finally and fully establishes the covenant with David. And he says, remember, I'm going to build a house for you. That's political language. That's a royal dynasty or dynasty. I've been listening to English podcasts a lot, so that's why I said dynasty. That is actually why I just said that. It's good. It's called The Rest is History. So you should check that podcast out. I don't get paid for that plug. But the dynasty is established. And it's, of course, the ultimate dynasty that leads us to what, ultimately? To another theocracy. Now, what do you think I mean by that? Who is the son of David, ultimately?
Jesus.
Jesus is the son of David. And what's another name for Jesus in the scriptures all throughout?
Son of man.
Son of man and king of what?
King of kings.
King of kings. So we're going to see that there is a number of, and certainly one, fundamentally important distinction. Jesus is going to say that his kingdom is not of this world in the same way, that Caesar to Caesar and God to gods. That's going to separate what those powers mean in this age. But I want us to understand that before we get too harsh with the idea of a theocracy, we should be wary, and just study history and the Bible, wary of establishing a sacral or sacred state that enforces the sacramental Christianity on people. Let's not be naive about that history, but also look at the scriptures and understand that that's not the age we're in. However, what I don't want us to ever assume is that we don't live under a theocracy. The fact of the matter is, the entire world is under a theocracy right now, as we talked about last week. We're all ultimately going to be judged by the true king. And we're in a season of grace where he's separated judgment from grace for a season. But let's keep going through and take a look at some of the shades of that. This kingdom, even before Jesus, in let's go to Psalm 2. Now let's go to Psalm 24. That's probably. This kingdom has ultimately envisioned a global reach. The earth is the Lord's, Psalm 24:1. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. For he founded it upon the seas, and he established it upon the waters. Take a look at Psalm 72 now. Someone read just the first 3 verses of Psalm 72 for us.
Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. Let the mountains bear prosperity for the people, and the hills in righteousness.
Go down and please read also verse 8.
May he have dominion from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth.
Actually, that's a significant verse in the history of Canada. Google it. You'll find out. From sea to sea. Get it? From sea to sea. So there's this. There's this global vision of Davidic dynasty that's established very early, even before the dynasty is fully established. This goes all the way back to Abraham, remember? All the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. Now, we're going to skip through the last 2 parts. What happens with this kingdom, by the way? This kingdom of Israel, what happens to them? How did it end for them?
Poorly.
It ended poorly. In 722, the Assyrians came down and destroyed the northern tribes. In 586, the Babylonians came down and exiled the other tribes. You can look at that information, and you can look at those verses later on. But really, I don't want to get lost in the scope of the history of redemption. I want to talk about how law operated, because that's really what we're discussing here. We're discussing how to engage in the political, legal apparatus of the world that we live in, not the ancient Israel world. I wanted to talk about I want to talk about theocracy, and let's see if this one works. It's pretty bad too. And law. I wonder if someone can give me a darker, or maybe just one that works. So when we start talking about how law operated in the kingdom of David and in the Deuteronomic constitution or covenantal structure, we have to understand that that not all law is exactly identical in the age of Israel. In fact, in a little while, we're gonna play a new game called Name That Law. So are you ready for that? So, but there's three sorts of law in the Old Testament. And this is going to be important when we start to think about how we apply Old Testament principles to the New Testament non-sacral political world that we live in, okay? The first kind of law, which I would be writing on the board if I had the opportunity now, is called the moral law. The second kind of law is often called civil or civic law. And the third kind of law is ceremonial law. So, who can give an example? Well, let me read a couple for you. Go to Exodus chapter 20. We're going to play Name That Law. I'm starting with an easy one. What's in Exodus chapter 20? All right. So, name that law, the 10 Commandments. Moral, table number 1. Guess it. But that was pretty easy, but we're still giving it to you, Lisa, because you spoke first. Okay. That's moral law. We're going to talk in a little bit about how moral law can be applied to us in every age, everywhere. But before that, let's go to Exodus 23:19. Someone read that verse. Thanks, man.
The best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God.
All right. Name that law. Ceremonial law, all right. See, you guys are so good. Maybe that's because I'm such a good teacher. That's what I'm going with. And then let's do another one here. This is going to be easy because I've made it easy for you. It's a pedagogical tool. Let me see, 21. Yeah, let's do 21, 12, and 13. Who can read 21, 12, and 13?
Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee.
So, name the law. Civil law. Now, why would this be helpful when we understand the nature of theocracy, that the nation of Israel was indeed sacred? It was set apart. It was a distinct political community dedicated comprehensively to the worship and obedience of the maker of heaven and earth. Which other nation on the earth has ever been given that kind of a charter? None. Exactly right. Remember going back to last week, we saw that in Noah, the emergence of the elements that would generate the need for government were established in chapter 9. And all of those, we called all of those nations common. They were common nations that had true authority, but they weren't sacred. In other words, they didn't have a sacred, what we would call sacramental, or in the language of the ancient Near East scholarship, a cultic reality to them. Not meaning cult like we would envision a religious sect today, but meaning that they were sacramental or had sacrifice or liturgy or worship at their center. God envisions a whole world full of common nations. What's the common nation closest to us right now at this moment? That's a trick question.
The US.
The U.S.,
Yeah,
exactly right.
Us.
Us. It's us. But when we look at all these laws, when we look at all these kinds of laws, we are talking about a unique relationship between God and not only a people, but also the political apparatus of that people. And the structures, the judicial system, the liturgical system, and also the ethical system of their entire nationhood, everything about them. So if we can then jump ahead a little bit, and we haven't covered this yet, but I'm sure you know the answers to this question. What happened to the nation when Jesus came as its king and opened up its doors to the whole world? What happened to the civil law? It was abrogated. No one on earth now is required in the same way, we're going to talk about this in a minute, to operate judicially the way Israel did. Now we're going to talk about, we already talked about why governments can operate judicially and exercise the sword. But in terms of the specific realities of who died and who lived and what penalties there were, those were given to a specific state with a sacred relationship to Yahweh that no other state has been granted, no other nation has been granted since the time of Christ. Of course, this is a little easier. What happened to the ceremonial laws? They're gone. Why? Because Jesus fulfilled them. Actually, in significant ways, Jesus fulfilled the civil law too, because he suffered punishment for sins, which sins also are always public and private. They always, my sins, the way I live, even if it's private, affects my neighbors. It's just the way that it is. So let's take a look now at how we can think about moral law in our current age. So let me read the blue box for you. This is from the Westminster Confession of Faith. It's our denomination's creedal document. We're picking it up in their chapter on the law in 19. And we're going to land on this last verse. Besides this law, commonly called moral, preceding verses, God was pleased to give the people of Israel as a church under age ceremonial laws containing several typical ordinances, that means types or pictures, partly of worship, prefiguring Christ, his graces, actions, sufferings, and benefits, and partly holding forth diverse instructions of moral duties, all of which ceremonial laws are now abrogated under the New Testament. To them also, that is Israel, as a body politic, he gave sundry judicial laws, which expire together with the state of that people, not obligating any other now further than the general equity thereof may require. There's some important words. What do you think of that? What is he getting at, that last phrase? We're not obligated to them except by the general equity thereof. What do you think the divines, the guys that wrote it, what do you think they're getting at with that?
We consider that like a fairness doctrine.
Yeah. Like, for example, an eye for an eye, right? I mean, an eye for an eye is still a bumper sticker. An eye for an eye, the whole world goes blind. Well, that's one way to look at an eye for eye, if you just look at it with one eye, pun intended. But, and Jesus didn't quite certainly abrogate that, but also an eye for an eye is actually a law that limits retribution. Because you can't take two eyes for one eye. So, for example, if you stole something, if you stole a lamb, I can't remember the exact numbers, but if you stole a sheep in Israel, you had to pay back, I think, 2 sheep. If the sheep died, you had to pay back, I think, 5 sheep. Someone on the inner Google, look that up. I'll get my numbers right. But what does that tell us? What is the general equity thereof? What does that instruct us about dealing with thieves?
There's limits to what you can do.
Yeah, there's limits to what we can enforce them to pay back.
Should be proportional.
It should be proportional. These are the things we could take. Also, here's something fascinating. I heard this because a criminologist was in our church plant. I had him teach on the penal systems of the Old Testament. And he made a very compelling case that the Old Testament judicial system emphasized retribution, not incarceration. Which is a fascinating insight, especially relative to our current state of affairs. So what I'm trying to get at is that the relationship of the moral law to common governments is that it's still instructive for governments as a wisdom measure for how to respond to crime and sin, public sin. All right? Now, but what can't we do? We can't just simply proof text. We just can't proof text the Ten Commandments and then apply civic instrumentality to enforcing them. But here's the problem. Every law, everywhere, in every age, is a response somehow to the Ten Commandments, whether they want to acknowledge it or not. It's inescapable. Remember what we saw? Where did Paul say the law of God is written? In our hearts. We saw that last week. The law of God is written in our hearts. So, let's go to the next page. Really what I want to drive home, we're going to look at the nature of Jesus' reign more throughout the class. But who can go to Romans 1 through 4? And read maybe it's the first 5 verses, read those to me.
Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all the nations.
All right, so I'm going to go to 1 Timothy 6. Obedience to all the nations. Did you get that? That's a pretty robust expression in an age that doesn't like obedience. Which, I'm not saying any age was totally stoked about obedience. But who can read 1 Timothy 6, 16 and 17? Well, that doesn't seem right.
Yeah, it starts weird.
Okay, sorry, 15 and 16. Sorry.
Which he will display at the proper time. He who is blessed and only sovereign, the King of kings, the Lord of lords, who alone has immortality, who dwells in unapproachable light, whom no one has ever seen or can see. To him be honor and eternal dominion. Amen.
Amen. So you can look at those other verses. What I'm trying to drive home is that the New Testament is unapologetic and assertive about the reign of Christ. Now, I want to know, by a show of hands, and then he winks, how many of you have ever been arrested? You were just adjusting the camera, weren't you, Scott? We're just going to let that just lay there. No one's ever going to know what the answer is. Well, I will tell you, I have been arrested. I was 17, and this is now forever on the internet. And we had one beer in the car, and the guy that was driving was both the other guys, one guy was driving, the other guy was 18, and so because of the hero that I am, I said, well, I'm 17 and I'm a minor, because we got pulled over. I'm a minor, and I'll just say it was mine. It was kind of ours. So anyway, so to my surprise, as an upper middle class suburban white kid in an upper middle class suburban municipality, the guy arrested me. And like with handcuffs and everything. And I was like, do you think the handcuffs are necessary? And he said, you can't always tell the good guys by what? Their white hats. I think he probably meant white faces. But anyway, so I go there, and I had this whole experience of being in absolute subjection to inescapable authority for the first time in my life. And I mean, they did everything. They did the mug shot and everything. I had to call my mom. This hilarious story about waking my mom up at like 12:30 at night. And the phone, I'll tell you the clean version. I wake up and she's like, Michael, what's wrong? She's panicking that I'm somehow injured. Panicking. I'm like, I can't even get a word in edgewise. She's almost screaming. I go, Mom, it's all right. I'm all right, Mom. I'm in the Glendale police station. She immediately changes her tone. She goes, you dumb. I just leave it at that. But the point is, we so rarely, many of us, most of us, certainly the kind of people that are in this room that live in a space that has a lot of influence and cultural and social authority, really. We're so very rarely in a space where we're completely dominated by an authority. I was going from Russia to Latvia, and I went through customs, and I'll straight up say, I was essentially assaulted in customs. Like, if that had happened in America, I absolutely would have sued the TSA. It was extremely unpleasant. But I was in a space where I had absolutely no civic leverage. Now, why am I bringing up these stories about my checkered past? Because they accent the fact that we in America, most of us, are not used to being unequivocally subjected to a king or to an authority. Now, thankfully, our king is not like Latvian customs. And he's gracious when we do break his law. But what I want to get into our heads in this class is what that cheesy little image at the side of this part of our lesson teaches us, that Jesus as king is not a spiritual metaphor. He is your absolute, unchecked monarch beyond which there is no appeal. You and I are required to do every single thing he says in every circumstance we are ever in. He is gracious and compassionate and slow to anger and abounding in love, and he knows that we're just made of dust. But none of that changes the fact that you and I have a king. And that means that everywhere we go, everything we do, we exercise for his majesty and according to his purpose. And this is what I want to drive home in the context of this class, including what we think of political issues and how we vote. You don't get to vote for anyone but your king. Because guess what? You don't get to spend money for anyone but your king. You don't get to spend your time for anyone but your king. You don't get to use your brain for anyone but your king. Or your friendships or your relationships or your words or anything else for anyone but Jesus. That's what it means to have a king. And it's hard for Americans who got all riled up about having a king to get their head around really having a king. And I want us to understand what that means before we see how Jesus handled his kingship. Now, is anyone else willing to tell the story of their arrest? Scott, this is your last chance. It was expunged from my record because I did community service, and for a bunch of Saturdays, I was the guy with the yellow vest on and the bag of trash and the little thing walking through town picking stuff up and putting it in the trash bag. And all my friends' dads who found out about it used to drive by when they saw me and roll the window down and laugh at me. This was a thing for about a month in Glendale. So I'm sure the elders will have a word with me after. This was not part of this did not come up in my interview process, Keith, I'm sorry. So having established that, and we'll come back to it, that it's not a spiritual metaphor. Let's talk about what Jesus let the world do to him as a king. And we're not going to get through this whole handout today, so don't worry about me hitting the gas pedal. Now, there's a couple things that Jesus does. So now that we've established that Jesus is truly a king, and we're truly responsible to him, and by the way, is it just the church that's responsible to him? Ultimately, what does Philippians 2:10 say? Who's going to be before him at the end of days? Everybody will be. So there's two ways, and this is going to be important for understanding of how Christianity works. You can see the diagram there. Jesus submits to Israel, and he submits. I might have this backwards actually.
Submission on the bottom.
Yeah. Thanks. Jesus submits to Israel and he submits to Rome, while at the same time he rules them both. By the way, is Israel still a theocratic monarchy at the time of Jesus? Be careful.
Not the nation.
No.
What's that?
Not the nation.
Covenantally, I mean, in reality, you're right, Charles. In political, historical reality, they don't got much going for them. But in the arc of covenantal history, they still are exactly who they've always been. So let's take a look at Jesus submitting to them and his submission to the temple state. Someone go to Matthew 17:24 through 26 and read that for us. Or I can.
When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" He said, "Yes."
I love that. Peter probably doesn't know what the answer is, but he's like, "Oh yeah."
And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" And when he said, "From others," Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free.
Keep going, you.
However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself."
So you can see what Jesus is doing there. Remember his ambivalence about these things? Jesus is just his attitude about the temple tax. And they're still, by the way, a temple state. That's why I asked that question earlier, that Charles answered properly historically, but covenantally, they're still exactly who God made them to be. And Jesus just lives into that. It's like, what is he saying? That's such a remarkable statement. He's saying, you know what? I'm the king. I'm the heir apparent. I don't pay taxes. People pay taxes to me, but whatever. Now go to 21. I'll read 21, 12, and 13. Jesus entered the temple area and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned tables and the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. And then the blind and the lame come to him. There's some reflections of what happens in David's kingdom there. So you can see in this exact, in these two parallel passages, or these two related passages, you can see Jesus doing what he does all through his ministry, which is subject himself to authority and then claim authority over authority the whole time. Now let's take a look at how he does that with a Roman state. 22, 21. Any questions about that?
So, 21, they said Caesar's. Then he said to them, therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.
So that's a famous passage that's going to have implications for this whole course of study. But I want us to see now, in what ways does that attitude towards the coin, how does that relate to Jesus' attitude towards the temple tax? There's a similar sort of ambivalence and recognition of the whole thing. His attitude towards the state is that it's essentially a necessary instrument that he doesn't really, to use an English term, put a lot of coin in. But let's go to John chapter 8 and see how Jesus then circumvents that. Excuse me, John chapter 18. And see how Jesus circumvents that. And then I'll try to wrap this up, because this is the part of the Duesenberry book that is a little bit geeked out, that I hopefully want us to come to terms with it in a little bit. So John 18, you can start to see Jesus undo his subjection to the Roman authorities. Let's take a look at John 18, verse 33. That doesn't work when you're looking at Luke 18. Who can read? Let me read it. Pilate then went back inside the palace and summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "Is that your own idea? Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" he replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," Pilate answered. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I'm a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." And then Pilate's famous answer about truth. And what is it? You can see that in this moment, what do you think Jesus means when he says, because we've already seen him have dominion over this in the temple, and now he's dominion over this. What do you think Jesus means when he says, "My kingdom is not of this world"?
It's universal.
It's universal, it is. That's an implication that's certainly worked out later on. Do you think it means it doesn't concern the world?
Does he mean it doesn't work the way the world works?
That's one of the things exactly that it means. And I think that's a great way, that's exactly how to think about it. When he says of the world, he's meaning it doesn't operate out of the systems and assumptions and dysfunctions of this world. He does not mean it's got nothing to do with this world. It means it's not ultimately born of this world. It's not drawn out of this world. You know, in a manner of speaking, we could say Jesus is saying, my kingdom is not a Noahic kingdom. It's not, remember from last week, it's not Genesis chapter 6 kind of stuff. My kingdom is actually Genesis 1 and 2 before the fall kind of kingdom. And that's why this, far from Jesus saying there's two kingdoms, one in heaven and one on earth, and never the twain shall meet, far from sort of, the impenetrable Jeffersonian wall between church and state, which, by the way, was in a letter written to a bunch of Baptist brothers. It's not about that. It's about the orientation, the origin, the nature of the kingdom that he is establishing. That's why I said that last week, that secular is not a thing. And I said that on purpose to be provocative, because there certainly is a way in which non-sacred is a thing. Remember, we have common governments. So I understand that there's non-sacral governments, but there's no such thing as a space, politically or economically, or in your professional enterprise, or in your family relationships, or in your social community. There's no such thing as a place where Jesus' kingdom of another world or of above doesn't work. Equals everywhere. What I want to do, to go back to what I said about you have a king, and it's your job to do everything you do in every space, at every time. It's your job to live for that king. If you have $1, it's the king's dollar. If you have a vote, it's the king's vote. If you have a friend, then you're supposed to be the king's friend to him or her. This is the way everything is. What the reason, and then we'll talk about what Jesus is going to do with all this. And this is, I'm glad I had another week to think about how to say this, because it's probably the single most abstract thing that I want to get across in these 6 weeks. What Jesus does in this space between exercising dominion and submitting himself is he's actually going to create a space for Christians to live. We at one and the same time subject ourselves, let's just talk about the civic realities that we're in. We subject ourselves to them, and we live with and for an authority that's above them. And what Duesenberry will say later on, and we'll look at it next week, I hope. What we'll say later on is actually this space right here where we're all going to live, this space is actually the invention of religion. That's a pretty bold statement. Because until Jesus did this is Duesenberry's argument, and it's so abstract, I'll cover it again, hopefully saying exactly the same words next time. What it's so abstract is that what we have here is a whole temple state structure. What do I mean by a temple state? What's a temple state? It's a political entity that has a sacred temple at its heart, that the two are aligned perfectly. And what's the first one we talked about in our lesson today?
The theocracy.
The theocracy of Israel. What we'll talk about next week is that Rome itself is a different kind of temple state. Because guess who the emperor is? And guess who you had to make, why so many of our brothers and sisters were martyred in the first centuries after Christ, is because they wouldn't burn incense To who?
The emperor.
To the emperor. And so why this abstract principle is going to be important is because it's going to give us the space in which we live as Christians. That the idea of an earthly temple state is eradicated in this age. And we are then perpetually living in this world where we subject ourselves to the authority of the states that are around us and all municipalities, Seattle, whatever. We subject ourselves to that, but we also answer to and live for a authority and reality that all of them will ultimately be subjected to. So this is where I want you to go to the last page. We're going to jump ahead here. This space, this is where we're going to be political. Jesus, in this dominion submission, he creates for us this Venn diagram that you can see at the top of the page, which we'll return to next week. He gives us a life of allegiance, allegiances, remember, ambiguity, and advocacy. And this is, if you take away a visual from these classes, I want you to take away this visual. Because this is the convergence of our need to submit and our ultimate confidence in a greater authority. This is why, to go back to my earlier diagram, that's why the Roman world was so freaked out about the church. Because it posed a religious and political threat to the systems. And honestly, that should still be the church's job. We should submit in such a way and resist in such a way that creates a political and spiritual threat to the world around us. Now, I'm not asking you to go just be a bunch of Karens, okay? Do not be Karens. But I am saying that you cannot either withdraw or take over in the way that your instincts will want you to. Now, why is it important that I have allegiances in the plural? What are our allegiances? Who do I have to obey while I'm here in Seattle?
The governor.
Yeah, the governor, the mayor, the city council. But my allegiances need to be ordered. See, I have to submit here, right? But also, like anyone could ever read that. I have to submit here, but what do I also have to do? I also have to realize also that there will be points in which I have to obey and exercise a greater dominion over myself. Like, what I keep thinking to myself is, man, I have not been clicking on the updates. My worldview and my view of the world is so different than the world around me. I've got to start getting the updates because I don't believe the things that the people around me believe. And that's where you're going to be. And that is going to lead to ambiguity. Who feels like they just know exactly where they belong socially, culturally, politically right now? Appreciate your participation in the class, Scott. Yeah. For those of you who can't see, Scott's doing the AV, and every time I ask an awkward question, he's adjusting it. It looks like he's raising his hand. That's why we live in this launches us, submission and dominion launches us into ambiguity. And that's where we all live now. And what I'm trying to tell you is there's no escaping ambiguity. There's kind of there's two ways to escape ambiguity. One is to retreat, okay? And the other is to attack. And you don't get to do either of those. I have a friend, I asked him to lunch. And I said, hey, let's go to lunch. He goes, sure, I'll go to lunch. I go, you want to meet at the same place down by because he comes across, down by the ferry terminal. He goes, no, I don't go to Seattle anymore. So, excuse me? He goes, I don't go to Salem, our place is terrible. Place is just wicked. It's like, bro, you are a Christian, man. Could you imagine, look at it this way, let's say that I was a missionary in Istanbul, but I didn't want to live in Istanbul, because why?
Wicked.
Because it's wicked. But I would never do that, because I'm an American, and I don't believe I have a proprietary relationship over Istanbul. But Americans think they have a proprietary relationship over the United States. We'll have some discussion about Christianity in American history, but I want you to understand that that's a lot more complicated than you think. So we can't retreat, we can't attack either. We can't just take over the world. Now we're going to close here. But also, remember what I said about everything you do is done for the king. You also need to advocate for justice and righteousness. And, I'm sorry to say, holiness too. Economic, sexual, the nature of marriage, what happens with the family, how we handle divorce. So there you go, right there. Here is your social, cultural, religious, political life until you die. It's trying to intersect and manage all these things. And you can get a much clearer vision of this diagram here, thanks to Smart Art, right here. You can get it. But I want to leave you with this. This is, go back to the other diagram. Jesus submits and has dominion. And then he creates this whole space where you and I are going to live for the rest of our lives. And we'll explore how to live in that politically as we go ahead. All right, it's too late to answer questions as a group, but if you have some, I can stick around for a minute. Thank you very much.